Step aside, old lady. This simulator isn't for relics. The words cracked through the silence of the training bay like a gunshot. Sergeant Thorne stood tall in his pressed uniform, jaw set, lips curling into a smirk that carried the arrogance of a man who believed the world bent to his voice. His tone wasn't just dismissive. It was designed to humiliate. Every young trainee in the room shifted uncomfortably, caught between curiosity and unease. The military airbase simulator bay was dimly lit, the glow of monitors throwing ghostly blue reflections across steel walls. The air carried the faint hum of electronics and the sharp tang of machine oil, mixing with the nervous energy of cadets seated along the edges. A massive simulator dome stood at the center, its curved screens casting shadows like a looming presence, waiting to test whoever dared step inside. At the edge of the bay stood the target of Thorne's words, a woman in her late 50s, dressed plainly in civilian attire. To the untrained eye, she looked out of place. Simple grey jacket, her hair pulled back with no sign of military formality. Her posture was calm, hands clasped lightly in front of her, and her eyes, sharp, unwavering, locked on the simulator with the kind of quiet intensity only those who had lived through storms carried. The trainees exchanged quick glances. Most of them were barely in their 20s, fresh uniforms creased with the stiffness of new fabric, their futures tied to the results of exercises like this. Some tried to suppress nervous grins at Thorne's jab, while others lowered their eyes in discomfort. Sergeant Thorne thrived on that reaction. He always had. His reputation in the barracks was built on volume, swagger, and an uncanny ability to make others feel smaller than him. He had been a flight instructor for only 3 years, but he wore those stripes like a crown, convincing himself he was untouchable. And now, standing before someone he assumed to be an intruder, he saw another chance to assert dominance. "Didn't you hear me?" Thorne pressed, stepping forward, boots echoing against the steel floor. "This isn't some air show where you watch and clap. These simulators break men who've spent their whole lives flying. You'd better find a seat in the audience before you get hurt trying to keep up." The woman said nothing. Her stillness wasn't submission. It was measured silence. She didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't even look at him. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the instrument panel inside the simulator dome. Her eyes flicked across the blinking rows of indicators as though she could read the system's rhythm in an instant. To anyone watching closely, it was as if she were already flying the machine in her mind. That silence grated on Thorne more than any insult could have. He thrived on reactions, fear, anger, even laughter. Silence robbed him of victory. One of the younger cadets shifted in his seat, whispering nervously to the trainee beside him. "Why isn't she saying anything?" "Because she doesn't belong here," Thorne snapped before the whisper could fade, as though he had ears tuned to any challenge against his authority. "These simulators are for pilots in their prime, not babysitters from a nursing home." He chuckled at his own words, but the laughter was hollow, forced, and carried a sharp edge. The woman finally turned her head, just slightly, enough for the trainees to catch a glimpse of her expression. No anger, no fear, just patience like a storm cloud waiting on the horizon. Her lips pressed into the faintest hint of a smile, one that seemed to say she knew something no one else did. The trainees felt it, the strange shift in the room. Though Thorne's voice filled the bay, it was her silence that held the weight. "Why are you even here?" Thorne demanded again, stepping closer, his tone dropping to a growl. "Don't stand there like you know something I don't. This place will chew you up." Her eyes slid back to the simulator screen, her silence unbroken. But for those watching closely, there were signs. The way her fingertips brushed along the railing beside her, as though she knew the exact pressure points of the steel. The way she glanced at the throttle quadrant through the glass, as if counting the seconds between its automatic resets. Little things no civilian would notice. The bay's overhead speaker crackled to life, announcing the next training session. The words boomed through the chamber. "Simulator 3, Sergeant Thorne, you're up. Scenario: high-altitude stall recovery." The trainees straightened, the atmosphere thickening with anticipation. High-altitude stall recovery was one of the deadliest maneuvers to train. At 35,000 feet, a mistake meant a flat spin with no time to correct. Even seasoned pilots sweated during that simulation. Thorne grinned wide, tossing a mocking glance toward the woman. "Perfect. You'll get to see how the real professionals do it." He tugged at his gloves, adjusting them with exaggerated flair. The woman's silence persisted, but this time as she turned slightly to face the simulator, her eyes flicked toward him with a calmness that cut deeper than any retort. "She's not leaving," one of the cadets whispered. "Looks like she's staying to watch him crash," another muttered. "It's only half joking." Thorne barked a laugh and climbed into the cockpit, his boots thudding on the ladder steps. "Fine," he said over his shoulder. "Stick around. Maybe you'll learn something before you go back to your knitting." The canopy of the simulator closed with a hiss, sealing him inside. The hum of the engines surged, the screens inside glowing to life. Trainees leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide, waiting for the test to begin. The woman stepped closer to the glass wall, her presence calm but magnetic. Her reflection mingled with the glow of the simulation, a ghostly figure, unnoticed for what she truly was, yet radiating a quiet authority that unsettled anyone who dared meet her gaze. For the first time, one of the cadets found his voice. "Who is she?" he whispered. No one answered. But as the simulator roared and the lights flickered across her steady face, the question echoed in every mind, because deep down they all sensed it. She wasn't ordinary, not at all. The simulator bay vibrated with a low hum as the massive dome lit up with blue skies and the endless horizon. Inside, Sergeant Thorne gripped the control stick like it was an extension of his ego. He adjusted his headset, smirking as the holographic panels around him flickered to life. "Now watch closely," his voice boomed through the bay speakers, amplified for the trainees seated outside. "This isn't a game, and it sure as hell isn't something you can learn from books. Flying is about instinct, guts, and knowing when to push the throttle. You don't just learn this. You're either born with it, or you're not." Several cadets nodded nervously, drinking in every word. Others glanced sideways at the woman who stood silently by the glass, her arms folded neatly in front of her. She hadn't moved since Thorne had climbed inside, her eyes fixed on the glowing screens with the precision of a hawk. Thorne chuckled to himself and yanked the simulator's throttle forward. The holographic aircraft roared down the digital runway, engines screaming. The base shuddered as the vibration system kicked in, rattling the seats of the trainees. "See that takeoff?" Thorne said smugly, as the simulated jet lifted from the ground. "Textbook, smooth climb, minimal yaw, perfect pitch angle. That's experience, cadets. Something you don't get by—" He paused, letting his gaze flick deliberately toward the silent woman. "Standing around pretending you belong." The cadets shifted again. Some smirked nervously following his lead, but others frowned. Sensing the imbalance in his swagger, the woman's lips pressed into the faintest curve, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement of his words. Her eyes darted to one of the side monitors, catching the faint fluctuation in the simulated engine temperature. She noticed it instantly but said nothing. Inside the simulator, Thorne missed it completely. He was too busy narrating his own flight. "Notice how I maintain climb with a steady 7-degree pitch," he declared, his tone heavy with self-importance. "Most rookies would overcorrect, cause a stall, not me. That's what separates pilots from passengers." A quiet voice broke through the silence. "It wasn't Thorne's. Pitch is closer to 9 degrees, the woman murmured almost under her breath. The cadets blinked. Her words weren't sharp or challenging, just factual, a small correction spoken as if she were commenting on the weather. But in the charged silence of the room, it landed like a pebble dropped into still water. Thorne's head snapped toward the glass. "What was that?" He barked. She didn't answer. Her gaze remained on the instrument, steady, unreadable. Thorne snorted, forcing a laugh. "See that, cadets? Even the spectators want to feel important. But let me tell you, confidence isn't built on nitpicking numbers. It's built on control." He banked the simulator hard left, the holographic sky tilting violently. The cadets grabbed their seats as the vibration plates rumbled beneath them. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Thorne gloated. "Most of you couldn't handle a turn like that without spilling your guts. But this is how you separate leaders from followers." Again, the woman tilted her head ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing at the simulated horizon. "Overbanking," she said softly. 65 degrees. Excessive for this altitude. It was almost a whisper, but every cadet heard it. They froze, eyes darting between her calm expression and the blustering sergeant inside the dome. Thorne's smirk faltered. His cheeks flushed as he tightened his grip on the controls. 65 is precisely what I intended," he snapped. It shows confidence. It shows mastery. The simulator lurched, turbulence data feeding into the system. The jet rattled, warning lights flashing briefly. Thorne cursed under his breath, correcting sloppily. The cadets noticed. And more importantly, they noticed her. She hadn't moved. Her face betrayed no satisfaction, no triumph at being right. She simply watched, her eyes calm, her stance unshaken. The imbalance grew sharper with every passing second. Thorne's voice rose, desperate to reclaim dominance. "You think numbers matter in combat?" he shouted. "Out there, it's about guts. Fire in your veins. A man's will is stronger than some blinking light." He slammed the throttle forward, the simulated jet screaming as it climbed. The dome vibrated violently, metal rattling in its frame. "Sir, the engine temp," one trainee blurted instinctively, pointing at the rising gauge on the monitor. "Quiet," Thorne barked. "I know what I'm doing." The woman's eyes flicked to the gauge, then back to the horizon. Her face didn't change. She simply clasped her hands tighter behind her back. The cadets exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, a ripple of doubt moved through the crowd. One of them leaned toward another, whispering, "She saw that before he did." Thorne's bravado only swelled. He turned the simulator into a steep dive, laughing as alarms blared. "This is how you test your limits. This is how you find out who's a pilot and who's dead weight." The woman finally shifted her gaze to him, her eyes cool and steady. There was no fear in them, no hesitation, just a look, and quiet, piercing, almost pitying. The cadets felt it. They leaned forward in their seats, caught between discomfort and fascination. It was as though they were watching two forces collide, arrogance in full display and silence that spoke louder than any shout. Thorne jerked the stick upward, pulling the jet into a violent climb. The simulator groaned under the strain, warning klaxons shrieking. He barked out technical jargon, half of it misused, to mask his growing loss of control. AOA steady at 15. Power compensating, stall recovery nominal. It wasn't nominal. The numbers flashing on the instruments told the truth. He was fumbling. The woman's eyes narrowed. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, as she spoke again. "Angle of attack is 21. Too high," the cadets gasped softly. She had corrected him again. Her tone not mocking, not challenging, and simply precise. Thorne slammed his hand against the console. "Shut her up!" he roared, though his voice cracked through the comms, echoing outside. "She's distracting you all from the lesson." But the cadets weren't distracted. They were riveted, not to him, to her, because for every mistake he tried to cover with bravado, she revealed the truth with a single measured word. And slowly, the balance of the room shifted. Some cadets clenched their fists, frustrated at her silence, wanting her to push back harder, to put Thorne in his place. Others felt the sting of shame, watching arrogance unravel while quiet strength endured. The tension coiled tighter with every second. Thorne's voice grew louder, harsher, desperate. He barked insults, gestured wildly, even slammed his fist against the glass when he exited briefly to reset a panel. For one chilling moment he leaned too close to her, his voice a low snarl. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her silence was unbreakable. The cadets' chests tightened. They wanted her to say something, to crush him with words, but she didn't. And that silence, that unbearable, calm in the face of arrogance, was worse for Thorne than any insult could ever be. The stage was set. Every cadet knew that she wasn't ordinary. And when the crisis came, it would not be Thorne who saved them. The simulator dome trembled as the scenario shifted. A sudden blast of static crackled through the speakers, followed by the automated voice of the system. New sequence initiated. Mid-air engine failure. Altitude, 35,000 feet. Weather, storm turbulence, begin. The blue horizon vanished, replaced by churning grey clouds and streaks of lightning that split across the curved screens. The sound of thunder reverberated through the bay, deep and menacing. The simulated aircraft jolted violently, as if caught in a sudden downdraft. Warning sirens screamed. Red lights flared across the cockpit displays. Engine 1. "Flame out," the automated voice barked. Inside the dome, Sergeant Thorne's smug grin faltered. He yanked at the throttle, shouting into his mic. "Stabilizers! Come on, damn it! Engine restart protocol." His words were a tangled mess, bluster without precision. His hands darted clumsily across the console, flicking switches in no particular sequence. Outside, the trainees gripped their armrests as the dome shuddered harder, rattling like the belly of a storm. "Altitude dropping," one cadet whispered in horror. Another muttered, "He's losing it." "He's actually losing it." Thorne's voice cracked through the speakers again, sharper, more frantic. "This isn't right. The engineers set this up wrong. Nobody could recover from a double flameout in this weather. It's sabotage." He slammed his fist against the side panel, curses spilling in frustration. "Shut down environmental systems. No, restart fuel flow. Damn it, it's not responding." The dome tilted violently as the simulator pitched into a nose-down descent. Trainees yelped as their seats rattled, one young cadet clutching his stomach before fainting sideways. "Pull up. He's stalling it out." Someone shouted. "I can't watch this," another muttered, covering their eyes. The shriek of the stall alarm pierced through the chaos. "Stall, stall, stall!" blared the system, accompanied by the sickening rattle of the simulated airframe buffeted by turbulence. Thorne's breathing turned ragged, his arrogance stripped bare, replaced by raw panic. "This is broken. The controls aren't. Somebody shut this damn thing down." Then, amid the chaos movement, the woman stepped forward. Her posture was calm, precise, unhurried, as though the world wasn't tearing apart around her. She approached the control console outside the simulator, her fingers gliding across the auxiliary panel with practiced certainty. "Override external input," she said softly, her voice carrying over the alarms. The technician nearby blinked in shock. "Ma'am, you can't." Her eyes flicked to him, sharp and commanding. "Now." The technician froze, then obeyed. Inside the dome, the controls shifted as her input took hold. Thorne stared down at the panels, bewildered. "What the hell? Who's touching my system?" The canopy hissed, and the simulator unlocked a secondary seat. Without hesitation, the woman stepped inside. The cadets gasped as the dome closed around her. For the first time, she took hold of the flight stick. Her hands didn't fumble. They moved with surgical precision, flipping switches in an exact sequence. Fuel cutoff, ignition reset, airflow balance. Shutting down engine 2 manually. "Adjusting mixture to lean," she murmured, almost to herself. The aircraft steadied slightly, though it continued to fall through the simulated storm. "Angle of attack, too steep," she noted calmly, her fingers easing the stick forward. The nose of the jet lowered just enough to regain controlled airflow. The stall alarm cut off. The cadet's eyes widened. Murmurs swept through the bay. She stabilized it. Inside, Thorne gaped at her, sweat dripping down his temple. "What are you doing?" "You'll crash us into the ground." Her voice remained even, almost gentle. "You've been fighting the storm." "You don't fight the storm. You fly with it." Her hands moved again, adjusting trim, shutting down all non-essential systems. The lights inside the cockpit dimmed, leaving only the glow of critical instruments. "We've lost both engines," she said matter-of-factly. "Power systems offline. We'll attempt a dead-stick landing." Thorne stared at her as though she'd lost her mind. "That's impossible. You don't land a fighter in storm conditions without power. You'll kill us all." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The jet plummeted through black clouds, lightning flashing across the curved screens. The sound of rushing wind filled the dome, louder, fiercer, like the roar of a beast closing in. Outside, the cadets gripped their seats so hard their knuckles turned white. "We're crashing," one whispered, his voice trembling. "She's insane," another muttered, but then they saw her face, calm, focused, unshaken. "Speed bleeding fast," she murmured. "Need at least 200 knots for control." Adjusting descent angle. Flare late, conserve lift. Her hands worked in perfect synchrony, every motion flowing into the next with the grace of someone who had done this not once, not twice, but countless times. The dome screamed warnings. "Impact imminent! Impact imminent!" Thorne clawed at the controls, trying to override her inputs. "You'll kill us!" he shrieked. She glanced at him, her eyes calm, her voice steady as stone. "Sit back. Sergeant, watch." The trainees held their breath as the simulated ground rushed up to meet them, a storm-lashed runway barely visible through sheets of rain. She pulled the nose up at the last possible moment. The jet's wheels scraped the digital tarmac with a screech, sparks flying across the curved screens. The entire simulator bay shook violently as the craft skidded, hydroplaning on the rain-slick surface. For a heartbeat, it seemed the jet would careen off the runway and explode into digital fire. But it didn't. The woman's hands held firm, guiding the jet straight, bleeding speed with masterful precision. The aircraft screeched, shuddered, then slowed, silence, the alarms cut off. The storm faded to the background. The simulator dome hissed to a halt, frozen on the image of a perfectly dead-sticked fighter resting safely on the runway. No one moved. The cadets sat frozen, their mouths open, their hearts hammering. One cadet finally whispered the words stuck in all their throats. She just landed the impossible. Inside the dome, Thorne sagged against his seat, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with disbelief. His arrogance was gone, stripped away by the reality he had just witnessed. The woman released the controls slowly, her composure never faltering. She unclasped her headset and set it down with quiet finality. Her voice was calm, almost too calm for what had just unfolded. "That," she said softly, "is how you earn respect." The simulator bay was silent, not the kind of silence born from calm, but the heavy, suffocating silence that follows the impossible. The storm on the curved dome screens still flickered faintly, rain sliding across the digital canopy. The fighter jet sat motionless on the simulated runway, smoke curling from its exhausted brakes. The trainees didn't move. Their breaths hung in the air as if they feared even inhaling too loudly would shatter the moment. She had done it. Against all odds, she had landed the impossible. Sergeant Thorne slumped in his seat inside the dome, drenched in sweat, his chest heaving like a man who had run a marathon he never trained for. His once bright eyes of arrogance now flickered with something else, disbelief, humiliation, and fear. She didn't just... One cadet whispered. Another leaned forward, voice shaking. That wasn't a landing. That was miraculous. The woman calmly removed her headset, her face as serene as if she had merely finished reading a book. No boast, no smile, just quiet finality. She stepped out of the dome, the hiss of hydraulics breaking the spell for a moment. The trainees' eyes followed her every move, their expressions shifting from confusion to awe. Thorne stumbled out after her, nearly tripping on the threshold. His hands shook as he tried to find words, any words, to salvage the authority slipping through his fingers. "That wasn't regulation," he stammered, his voice trembling. "The system must have given you some kind of override. No one could have..." His excuses trailed off when no one nodded. No one agreed. The woman didn't even glance at him. She merely brushed a strand of hair back and straightened her jacket with calm dignity. At that moment, the bay doors opened. Heavy footsteps echoed across the polished floor. A young officer entered, his posture straight, his expression stern. Without hesitation, he stopped directly in front of the woman, snapped his hand to his brow and saluted sharply. "Admiral Hayes," he said, his voice ringing through the stunned silence. "Ma'am, welcome back to command." The world stopped. The cadets' jaws dropped. Their whispers filled the air like sparks catching fire. "Admiral Hayes. Did he say... No, it can't be. The ghost." The officer's salute did not waver, and for the first time the woman turned slightly, acknowledging him with the smallest nod. Gasps rippled through the room. Admiral Evelyn Hayes. Call sign, Ghost. A legend whispered in every corner of the aviation world. The woman who had once flown a crippled fighter through a storm of enemy fire, guiding her wingmen home while her own engines bled flames. The ghost pilot who vanished from the skies years ago, leaving only myths behind. And here she was, standing in their simulator bay, unrecognized, underestimated, mocked, shoved aside like a relic. The cadets could barely breathe. "She's the ghost," one of them murmured, awe flooding their voice. "She's real." Thorne's face drained of all color. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. He staggered backward, his bravado stripped bare, the full weight of his arrogance crashing down on him. Admiral Hayes finally turned toward him. Her gaze was steady, not cruel but unyielding. "Respect isn't demanded, Sergeant," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of a storm and the clarity of truth. "It's earned." Thorne's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. But there was nothing he could say. Not after this. The cadets looked at Hayes with eyes wide, some with admiration, some with shame for doubting her. For the first time since the chaos began, they stood straighter, their shoulders squared. They had just witnessed a lesson no textbook or classroom could ever teach. Hayes didn't linger. She didn't gloat. She simply adjusted her jacket, her movements quiet and composed. To her, this wasn't about victory or proving someone wrong. It was about discipline, precision, and truth. The officer who had saluted her stepped closer. "The Command Council has been waiting for your return, ma'am." They never stopped believing the ghost still belonged in the skies. She gave the faintest of smiles, one laced with melancholy more than pride. "Ghosts don't belong anywhere. They only appear when they're needed." The words hung in the air, chilling yet inspiring. The cadets felt the impact of every syllable. One day, they realized, they might face storms of their own, chaos, arrogance, or fear. And in those moments they would remember her. Thorne's knees buckled slightly, and he leaned against the simulator's frame for support. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. I didn't know." Hayes's gaze softened slightly, but her words remained firm. "Then learn. That's why you're here." Her response wasn't spiteful. It wasn't a dagger to twist. It was an open door, the kind of rebuke that carried within it the chance for redemption if he chose to take it. The cadets watched as the sergeant, once loud and untouchable, stood silent and small in her presence. They understood then that arrogance wasn't strength. It was fragility disguised as confidence. Strength was quiet. Strength was steady. Strength was the woman they had almost dismissed as irrelevant. The officer gestured toward the exit, ready to escort Hayes to where command awaited. She walked forward with calm, unhurried steps, her presence commanding the entire room without a single raised word. Every trainee in the bay stood straighter as she passed. Not out of fear, out of respect. And as the doors closed behind her, the silence she left behind was no longer suffocating. It was reverent. The cadets would remember this day for the rest of their lives. The day they met the ghost. The day they saw respect earned, not demanded. And Sergeant Thorne? He would remember too, because the lesson had been carved into him sharper than any reprimand ever could. The simulator bay did not return to normal that day. Even after Admiral Hayes had left, the air remained charged, as if every molecule carried the echo of her presence. The cadets stood in silence for several long moments, their young faces marked with awe. For many, it was the first time they had witnessed greatness up close. Not the kind you read in training manuals, not the kind broadcast on military recruitment ads, but the raw, undeniable greatness of someone who had faced chaos and mastered it. Sergeant Thorne, however, stood apart. His face was pale, sweat clinging to his temples, his breathing uneven. The same man who had barked orders, shoved aside a woman, and sneered at her presence now seemed smaller. His frame weighed down not by failure alone, but by the truth that had been revealed. When the trainees began to whisper again, their voices carried none of the mockery that usually filled a training hall. Instead, they whispered her name, the ghost. She's still alive. She's better than the stories. It spread quickly. By the time the cadets left the bay, the tale had already begun weaving itself into legend. Word traveled like wildfire across the base. Officers passing through the mess hall caught fragments. Technicians working on fighter engines exchanged glances and murmurs. Within an hour, everyone knew the ghost had returned. Admiral Hayes had walked back into their lives not with fanfare, not with speeches, but with action. And in that single moment, she had shifted the culture of the base. Respect was no longer tied to rank shouted or authority demanded. It was tied to competence. To quiet mastery, but not everyone celebrated. Sergeant Thorne found himself in the commander's office the next day. His arrogance had been noted. His treatment of Hayes, though unknowing, had been disgraceful. His punishment was clear: probation, demotion in duties, and reassignment to remedial training. Yet Admiral Hayes intervened. "She is a leader," she told the council. "Leaders don't simply punish failure. They cultivate growth. The boy is reckless, arrogant, but arrogance can be reshaped. If you break him, he'll stay broken. If you teach him, he may rise." Her words carried weight. They always had. And so Thorne was spared from permanent disgrace. He didn't thank her. He couldn't. His pride still stung too deeply. But when he returned to the simulator, there was no sneer on his lips, no mocking laugh. His hands no longer gripped the controls with careless swagger. Instead, they trembled, not with fear, but with the realization of how far he still had to go. The trainees noticed. The same man who once belittled them now sat in silence before exercises, reviewing manuals, practicing harder than anyone else. His arrogance had been stripped away, and though humiliation lingered, something new had begun to take root. Humility. It would take time, but Hayes had given him that chance. And the cadets? Their lesson was permanent. They had seen with their own eyes that true strength didn't come from loud voices or slammed fists. It came from calm action, from the ability to face chaos and remain unshaken. Narration carried this truth as the story drew toward its end. True strength is silent. True legends don't shout, they act. And when they act, the world listens. The camera of the story lingered not on Thorne's humiliation but on his transformation. On the late-night hours when he stayed behind in the simulator, flying through storms again and again, failing but refusing to quit. Each failure chipped away the arrogance until what remained was discipline. The cadets began to respect him, not for what he had been, but for what he was becoming. And perhaps, in time, he too would carry a fragment of Hayes's lesson into the skies. The base itself seemed to carry a new energy. Conversations shifted. When instructors barked orders, cadets no longer responded out of fear, but with the quiet determination that maybe, just maybe, they too could earn respect the way Hayes had. Legends, after all, weren't distant. They weren't untouchable. They walked among them, and in the stillness of the night, in the hum of engines cooling on the runway, whispers carried through the ranks, the ghost still flies. For the audience, the narration closed with a cinematic line, a thread tying the entire story together. She came not to prove herself, but to remind us all that greatness doesn't fade with time, nor does respect bow to arrogance. True legends never die. They wait, silent, until the world needs them again. The music would swell here, soft strings overlaid with the faint hum of jet engines, a perfect blend of inspiration and awe. And just as the story reached its final note, the narrator's voice transitioned into the outro, smooth, seamless, never breaking immersion. For more stories of forgotten heroes and hidden legends, stay with us. There are many ghosts in history waiting to be remembered.